Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning if you're in India. Joining me today for NGG's Australia-India Conversations is Australia's former Prime Minister, the Honourable Tony Abbott, AC. Prime Minister Abbott is someone who has kept Australia-India ties at the very forefront of his engagement. He was the first foreign leader to visit India when Narendra Modi took over as Prime Minister in 2014, following which PM Modi visited Australia. This after a gap of 28 years. There has been significant movement in Australia-India ties since then, with a renewed interest also for a free trade agreement. Let's learn more from Mr. Abbott about the aspirations he has for his relationship and how fast and far we can build a strong partnership between Australia and India. Hello, Mr. Abbott. Thank you for participating in the Australia-India Conversations today with us. Let's get straight down to some of the questions, if you don't mind. Look, you've been visiting India since the 1980s. And as Prime Minister in 2014, you travelled to India in an official capacity to be the first foreign leader to personally congratulate PM Modi on his landslide election win. Tell us a little bit about your visit and why you felt important to go to visit India at that time.
Well, two things first, Dipen. I spent 3 months in India in 1981. I was going from Australia to England to study as a Rhodes Scholar. I had 3 months to kill between the finishing up of the College of Law here in Sydney and the beginning of term in England. And rather than just swan around on a Eurail pass or hit the beach somewhere in New South Wales, I thought, well, why not spend some time in India? A fascinating country, a very important country, and a country that I had long been very interested in. So I spent 3 months basically traversing northern India, spent a fair bit of time with the Australian Jesuit mission in Bihar, so it wasn't just the cities, it was the backcountry as well. And look, I thought then, as I think now, that the Australian people, the Indian people have a great deal in common. The fact that there are now so many people of Indian background living in Australia, making a wonderful contribution, backs me up on this. But obviously, as the world changes and India progresses economically, the balance of economic strength tilts to the Indo-Pacific region. It's important for countries like Australia to make the most of our friendship with India. Frankly, as the balance of power shifts against the democratic superpower, it's important that there be an emerging democratic superpower so that the world has two, not just one democratic superpowers, and obviously that's going to be India. So whatever I can do to build on this relationship, I am determined to do. I should also say that on the day Prime Minister Modi won his extraordinary landslide election, I was at a Liberal Party function in outer metropolitan Melbourne. The news came through that Prime Minister Modi had won in a landslide, and I retired to a stairwell to call him on a crackly mobile phone, and I suspect that was one of the first calls he would have had, if not the first call he had from an overseas leader. And I've got to say, we've gone on extremely well ever since.
Yeah. And is that what prompted you? Did he invite you to come to India at that time?
Look, I can't recall whether he extended an invitation then and there, but it had always been my intention to go to India as soon as I reasonably could. The relationship had been underdone for a long time. When Prime Minister Modi came here in 2014, it was the first Indian prime ministerial visit in almost 30 years since Rajiv Gandhi had come.
Yes.
And look, I think on both sides we'd been distracted by many other things. I mean, India obviously has the ongoing issue of development. Obviously, India has issues on its borders from time to time. An Indian Prime Minister has so much on his or her plate. And I think Australia became a bit infatuated with China for all sorts of understandable reasons. But as far as I was concerned, while I wanted the best possible relationship with China, I also wanted a much deeper and stronger relationship with India. And I'm pleased to say that I think in that I was following in John Howard's footsteps. In his last few years, John Howard put a lot of effort into the Indian relationship. Unfortunately, after several steps forward, there were a couple of steps backwards. And I know Scott Morrison is putting a lot of effort into the Indian relationship. I know he deeply regrets that it wasn't possible to go there in person because of the bushfires 12 months ago. But I know he wants to rectify that omission as quickly as he can.
Yeah. Look, so just sticking with PM Modi, today you enjoy a strong personal rapport with PM Modi. You've engaged with PM Modi on several occasions, including your recent visit to India in 2019. What is it that stands out for you in PM Modi's personality and more so in his leadership?
For the leader of a country of 1.4 billion people, he is a remarkably down-to-earth man. Now, he's also a deeply spiritual man, as you'd expect from someone who spent a significant part of his early life in contemplation. But he is remarkably down-to-earth and extremely personable. He's quite a tactile man, as I discovered. Yes. And look, that makes him very easy to get on with. He's very upfront. I mean, there are some people you meet who are very voluble, but you never feel you're really getting behind the mask, whereas you'd never say that with Prime Minister Modi. He exudes decency, wisdom, capability, and was always a wonderful interlocutor.
Would you like to elaborate on that tactile?
Well, look, I think the first time we met in person, he advanced towards me with his arms outstretched, and I could not but reciprocate. So I think it began with a hug, a mutual hug. Yeah.
Excellent. Great. Look, India and Australia share much in common, as you've stated. Why do you think that the relationship hasn't really met its potential to date?
I suspect that for quite some time it was because on both sides we were trying to distance ourselves from our past. Australia in the 80s and 90s was very keen to make its way in Asia, and when we said Asia then, we tended to mean East Asia.
Yes.
And I think India, for a long time, quite understandably, wanted to put the period of the Raj behind it. So I think we were both looking to the future and attempting to differentiate the present from the past. But I think, in a sense, both of us are more mature now. And I think the important thing is to make the most of our past and to build on it rather than to feel ambivalent about it. Now, Australia is incredibly lucky. We are a very stable, strong and prosperous country. We've taken our British heritage and made the most of it, improved it, frankly. And I think India, while being quite a distinctive culture and civilization, has also made the most of that element of its past. The fact that these days quite a lot of the entrants in the Booker Prize are from Indian authors, suggests that to a very great extent, India has taken what it got from that British period and built upon it, and likewise improved upon it.
So, why do you think Australia and India today can make really strong partners?
In the end, relationships have got to be built on values in common. And when I look at contemporary India, I see an intensely democratic country. I see a country which is fiercely protective of free speech, where human rights are taken extremely seriously, and where, to put it in its use a bit of Australian terminology, where everyone is trying to do the right thing by the battler. And of course, India's got a lot of battlers. The challenge of bringing 1 billion plus people from what are still more or less third world standards into the middle class is an enormous one. But look, India is getting on with it. And unlike China, it's doing it respecting people's rights rather than riding roughshod over them. The state is a facilitator rather than a master in India. And again, this is incredibly important, because in the end, you cannot build a relationship that is entirely one-sided. And the problem with our dear friends in Beijing is that their view is that every other country must tremble and obey, because they are the Middle Kingdom now and always.
Leading on from that, and the events that have happened recently through COVID and geopolitically globally, domestically, are we witnessing a strong positive narrative shift on India? And what's leading to that change? So if so, what is leading to that kind of change?
Well, look, all sorts of factors are at work here. At a very human level, the fact that there are now almost 1 million Australians of Indian background, plainly, is a consciousness-raising thing for Australians generally. The fact that for a couple of months of the year, a lot of us are focused on cricket versus India is obviously a significant factor when it comes to the popular mindset, if you like. Yes. Obviously, for those of us who think about these things, the whole geopolitical situation is a big factor. And just recently, we're very conscious of the need to diversify our trade and to ensure that we do not have potentially belligerent countries embedded in our supply chain. And if you're looking at an economy that could readily participate in Australian supply chains, India has very efficient manufacturing, particularly in things like pharmaceuticals and IT. There are all sorts of ways where India could slot pretty seamlessly into Australian supply chains. And because India is not only a democracy, but it's democracy under the rule of law. I know justice can sometimes be a little slow in India, but eventually you will get justice in India. And again, you can't say that about every other place. So I think for all these reasons, there is a heightened awareness of India, and it's important to build on this, particularly after that long period in the 80s and 90s of comparative neglect.
And look, there is definitely a shift in narrative, but one of the things that is still kind of an area of concern for people who are involved in the Australia-India trade relationship is the corporates. The Australian corporates are still quite hesitant in the India growth story. So, what do we need to do? I guess just to give you a bit of some facts here, in 2018, only 0.6% of Australia's outbound investment was allocated to India, which is less than allocated to countries such as Luxembourg, Netherlands, Bermuda, and Papua New Guinea. So, what sort of role can the government play in this? And what do we need to do collectively to get the corporates on board now?
That's a very good question. And look, two-way trade with India, an economy of 1.4 billion, is not that much larger than two-way trade with New Zealand, an economy of about 5 million. So there's plainly a lot of upside here. Yeah. The question is, how do we bring it about? Now, one or two Australian businesses have burnt their fingers in India. That shouldn't be a permanent deterrent, because all new and unfamiliar markets hold pitfalls. And if you go back 30 years, a lot of Australian and Western businesses burnt their fingers in China. But at least for a period of time, they persisted. And eventually, as we know, a two-way trade between Australia and China, and investment likewise, just exploded. Now, we all know there are all sorts of difficulties now, which are likely to get worse, not better, over the next period of time. But I would just say to businesses, don't be put off by initial difficulty. Persistence will pay off here, just as it's paid off in every other overseas market that Australia has entered. And let's look at the wonderful example of Adani. Adani came here almost a decade ago, wanting to develop what was then an undeveloped coal basin in Queensland. They met with obstacle after obstacle, some, I suppose, reasonable enough, but many utterly unreasonable. At times the victim of what I've described, what others have described as lawfare, a campaign of economic sabotage almost. But they stayed the course, and eventually, thanks to the Morrison government's victory in the 2019 election, the Queensland Labor government came to its senses, and now the Adani mine and railway is going full steam ahead. So Gautam Adani and his backers had to stick at it for almost a decade, but I am confident that now this particular operation will go from strength to strength, to the great benefit of India and also to the significant benefit of Australia. And we just have to take the view, if at first you don't succeed, try again.
Yeah. And look, Adani's one instance, but there's other companies. For example, the largest investment in New South Wales by an Indian company is almost $1 billion by Jindal Steel and Power, and they've only just now, after many years of trying, received approvals from the Planning Commission.
Exactly right. Yeah. So given that Indian businesses are having a go in this country, despite a lot of difficulty, some of it understandable, much of it not, some of it reasonable, much of it not, I think we've got to be prepared to make the same effort in India.
Absolutely. And if you look at the strengths of India, particularly in the services sector, the top Indian IT companies are all doing extremely well in Australia. When you look at TCS, Wipro, Infosys, there's so many of them, and they're assimilated into the Australian business circles so well that they're almost considered Australian. And when you look at companies like IBM, for example, most of their employees are Indian anyway.
And there is far more potential for Australian companies operating in India to feel local than there is for Australian companies operating in China, for instance. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. They will need to enculturate, but the fundamentals are going for them rather than against them in India.
I agree, totally. And particularly with the new changes that the government have made in the ease of doing business in India, as India has climbed to, I think, something like 63 in the World Bank's ranking for the ease of doing business from 140 a few years ago.
We're dropping and India's advancing.
And they're trying to get to number 50. So there's many positive policy changes, particularly in business.